On August 27, 1906, in the quiet county of La Crosse, Wisconsin, Edward Theodore Gein was born into a life that would become one of the most chilling cases in American criminal history. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gein. To outsiders, they were a humble farming family, scraping by in rural Wisconsin. But within the Gein household, darkness simmered under a strict moral facade, a darkness that would one day erupt into a horror the world would scarcely believe. Ed's father, George, was a man broken by his own failures. A former carpenter and tannery worker, he drifted into alcoholism, unable to provide stability. He was a distant, irritable figure in Ed's life, frequently unemployed and prone to rage. By contrast, Augusta Gein was a devoutly religious woman, fiercely puritanical and unyielding in her beliefs. She saw the world as a cesspool of sin, particularly sexual sin. To Augusta, women were Jezebels, tools of Satan whose sole purpose was to seduce men into moral decay. She filled Ed's head with biblical verses about damnation and punishment. Her sermons were relentless, and Ed, shy, impressionable, and desperate for her love, absorbed every word. In 1914, when Ed was 8 years old, the Geins moved to a 160-acre farmhouse outside the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Augusta wanted her family cut off from the world. She saw Plainfield as a place where her sons could grow up free from the evils of society. For Ed, this move cemented a life of near-total isolation. Ed's days were spent performing farm chores and listening to his mother's sermons. He and his older brother, Henry, rarely ventured far beyond the farm. Any contact with outsiders was tightly controlled. Ed wasn't allowed to have friends. Augusta saw other children and their families as corrupt influences. At school, Ed was shy and quiet, often ridiculed for his strange mannerisms. Classmates recalled him giggling randomly, as if privately amused by some joke only he understood. Teachers noted he struggled socially, but was a diligent student. There were early warning signs that something was wrong. A neighbor once recalled seeing Ed stare for hours at a woman walking down the road, his eyes wide with fascination and confusion. And then there was the now infamous incident when Ed's aunt awoke in the night to find young Ed standing over her, his face expressionless, kitchen knives laid out neatly around her on the bed. At home, Augusta kept Ed close. She read to him daily from the Old Testament, dwelling on passages about death, punishment, and divine wrath. Any natural curiosity Ed had about girls or sexuality was swiftly and violently condemned. As Ed matured, the family dynamics grew increasingly strained. George's alcoholism worsened. Fights between Augusta and George were fierce, with Ed often caught in the middle. George died in 1940, leaving Augusta, Henry, and Ed to manage the farm. Henry began to push back against Augusta's iron rule. He wanted a life outside the farm and often criticized Augusta in Ed's presence. Ed bristled at any criticism of his mother. To him, she was near divine. In the spring of 1944, Ed and his brother Henry were clearing marsh vegetation by burning it on their property. The fire got out of control, and although Ed was rescued, Henry was later found deceased. The official cause was ruled accidental, but there were a few inconsistencies that led to quiet speculation. No charges were filed, and the matter was never pursued further. Not long after Henry's death, their mother, Augusta, suffered a series of strokes. Ed became her caregiver, attending to her needs as her health steadily declined. When she passed away in December 1945, Ed was devastated. She had been the most important person in his life, and without her, he felt unmoored and alone. After her death, Ed closed off the rooms Augusta had used, the parlor, the living room, and her bedroom, preserving them just as she had left them. Over time, these rooms became untouched spaces in a house that otherwise began to fall into neglect. Ed withdrew into a small room near the kitchen, where he lived in increasing isolation. Outwardly, Ed maintained a modest, unassuming presence in the town of Plainfield. He worked odd jobs and was seen as quiet but helpful. Children in the neighborhood often liked him, and he was known to assist neighbors when needed. But privately, Ed was struggling. The loss of his mother had left a profound void in his life, and he found it difficult to connect with the world around him. In his solitude, Ed developed an intense interest in certain books and magazines, many dealing with crime stories or unusual medical subjects. His sense of reality began to shift, and he became increasingly preoccupied with themes of identity and transformation, particularly as they related to his mother's memory. He spent more time alone, and his thoughts turned inward, reflecting a growing detachment from the world around him. He started robbing graves. Under the cover of darkness, Ed would dig up recently buried women, open their coffins, and remove body parts. Sometimes he took entire corpses home. Other times, he stashed away specific pieces of flesh, preserving them with oils and chemicals. He began creating household items from human remains, lampshades made from human skin, bowls crafted from skulls, masks constructed from the peeled faces of corpses. Most chilling was his woman suit. Ed admitted he wore it to become my mother, to literally crawl into her skin. In these moments, he felt Augusta's presence inside him. For years, Ed's grave robbing went unnoticed, but eventually, fantasy was no longer enough. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan, the owner of a tavern in Pine Grove, disappeared. Bloodstains were found at the scene, but no body. When locals joked about Mary's vanishing, Ed reportedly quipped, "She's not missing, she's at my house right now." People laughed it off as Gein's bizarre sense of humor. 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Plainfield was rocked by another disappearance. Bernice Worden, owner of the local hardware store, vanished. Her son, Frank Worden, a deputy sheriff, found the store empty. The cash register was missing. Blood stained the floor. Suspicion immediately fell on Ed Gein. The day before, he'd visited Bernice's store, mentioning he'd returned for antifreeze. Investigators headed to the Gein farm. Deputy Sheriff Art Schley and other officers arrived at the Gein farmhouse on a cold November evening. The house was dark. As officers searched the property, Schley stepped into a small woodshed and came face to face with pure nightmare. Hanging upside down from the rafters was the body of Bernice Worden, dead and gutted like a deer. Her torso was from sternum to pelvis. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle. Inside the farmhouse, officers uncovered a scene that defied imagination. Skulls perched atop bedposts, human skin used to make lampshades and chair covers, a collection of human noses, masks made from the faces of women, a heart in a saucepan on the stove, the now infamous woman suit. The entire house was a chaotic labyrinth of filth, decay, and unspeakable artifacts. Ed Gein was arrested and brought in for questioning. In his soft, childlike voice, he confessed to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. He calmly described how he'd shot Bernice and dragged her body back to the farm. He admitted to grave robbing, but insisted he'd only killed 2 women. When asked why he kept body parts, Ed explained he wanted to create a woman suit so he could become his mother. He claimed he entered trances during grave robbing, sometimes unable to remember what he'd done. During questioning, Ed showed no outward emotion. He seemed more puzzled than disturbed by the horror he'd caused. Initially, Ed Gein was deemed incompetent to stand trial. He was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and a severe personality disorder. He was disconnected from reality, unable to comprehend the magnitude of his crimes. In 1968, doctors declared Ed fit for trial. His proceedings were held without a jury to avoid inflaming public sentiment. Ed pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Judge Robert H. Golmar found him guilty of Bernice Worden's murder, but insane at the time of the crime. Ed was returned to Central State Hospital, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He was never tried for Mary Hogan's murder. Prosecutors saw no point in further trials, given Ed's commitment and the costs involved. In the hospital, Ed Gein lived a quiet existence. Staff described him as polite, helpful, and cooperative. He enjoyed reading, working in the hospital shops, and gardening. He seemed to retreat into a private world, rarely discussing his past. Despite the monstrous crimes he committed, Ed maintained an eerie aura of childlike simplicity. One psychiatrist described him as the most polite patient we ever had. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. He was 77 years old. He was buried beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery. Over the years, his grave became a grim tourist attraction. In 2000, his headstone was stolen but later recovered in Seattle. Ed Gein killed only 2 confirmed victims, a comparatively low number in the annals of American serial killers. Yet his crimes horrified the nation in ways few others have. It wasn't merely murder, it was the transformation of human bodies into grotesque trophies and household objects. His story spawned legends and fictional murderers. Norman Bates in Psycho, 1960, inspired by Gein's devotion to his mother and double life. Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, who wore masks made of human skin. Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, who wanted to create a woman suit. Ed Gein's crimes peeled back the mask of normalcy in American life. He lived quietly among neighbors, known as an odd but harmless man. No one suspected that behind the doors of his farmhouse lay a kingdom of nightmares. Ed Gein did not merely commit murder, he redefined the limits of human depravity and left behind a story that continues to haunt American culture.